everybody. Hello, wow, full house. This is great. Great turnout. So I'm so glad that you're interested in hearing more about Nelle. Welcome to our March Brown Bag. I'm Terry Emma, the director here at the museum, and thrilled to see all of you here. We have 2 more brown bags for this season, and then we take the summer off, and there'll be a children's exhibit in this room called The Curious World of Colonel Fabyan. So if you've got grandchildren, neighbors, children who are interested, ages 3 to 10, there'll be something for all ages. There'll be an actual windmill in here, not as big as the real one. Where's Craig? No pressure, Craig. Craig is building. There are plans for a windmill. There are plans for a Japanese garden moon bridge and some coding as well. And we're still in the works of putting it all together, but I guarantee that it'll be great fun, not only just for kids. Our last exhibit last summer on the children's Viking exhibit, we had adults in here, of course, throwing the axe game and having a great time. So it's not just kids only. So I encourage you to come this summer, June through August, and you can check out our calendar that is out in the main lobby. But be sure today, if you have not already seen Saving Fabyan's Legacy, the Darlene Larson story, which opened last month, you have to come see it. Even if you were here opening night, it was too hard to really absorb all of it and read it. We encourage you to come back and visit. There's just a lot of content to dig into. So after the exhibit, you're more than welcome to go on in, and of course, come back anytime. So let's get right into this because there's a lot to cover. Heidi's going to hit the lights, which will help see the screen a little bit. So many stories are told about the Colonel George Fabyan, and it was interesting. Everyone hears about him and all of his work and his scientific experiments, but not much has been shared about his wife, Nelle Wright Fabyan. So during this exhibit design, I wanted to create an introduction to the exhibit about Nelle and George and tell people why the estate even exists. Well, George's information was easy, right? We all know, we can all talk about George. I got to Nelle, and I had a blank, and I thought, what am I going to write about Nelle? And I did a little research, and it just seemed like everybody kept saying, not much is known about Nelle. Not much is known about Nelle. Well, I thought, okay, let's just see what I can find. And I ended up spending weeks on this fascinating woman because there's just so much more available now online that you can get. And Darlene had some great photographs, and she had some wonderful information to add to this collection. So I want to share with you today Nelle Wright Fabyan and this fascinating woman. So based on my timeline that I created of all this information I found, I kind of separated Nelle's life based on 4 themes. She was a socialite, she was a farmer, she was a sculptor, and a philanthropist. And all of those things, I'm sure she was more than that, but to get it down to a 45 to 50-minute program, they kind of intertwine at times and overlap. But those are the 4 things that really stuck out to me as to her main interest in what she did in her life. Let's start out with a socialite, as most of us would think of Nelle being the wife of the Colonel. And we'll start with Nelle May Wright was born in 1866 in Marinette, Wisconsin, to Eli Wright and Laura Eleanor Wright. Nelle was the oldest of 3 brothers, Robert, Frederick, and Ralph, and 2 sisters, Jessie and Leah. Her father, Eli, worked for a lumber company and ran a general store for years in several locations in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and possibly Pennsylvania. So Darlene had this picture of Eli Wright's store. It didn't mark exactly where it is. And I did find an indication of him being a dry goods store owner in several spots. But in 1870, Eli Wright founded the Wausau Iron Works, which built machinery for railroads and sawmills in north and central Wisconsin. He later bought the Menominee Iron Works Company and moved it to Wausau, Wisconsin. Eli had this Italianate-style house built for his family in 1881, and it is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. At one time, it was operated as a restaurant called the Wright House, but today I looked up and it's the home of the Center for Wellbeing, but it's still there and it looked beautiful online. But if you're ever in Wausau, Wisconsin, it might be a nice place to go take a stop. Nelle's early years, still, I had trouble. Everyone had said, Nelle was hard to research. In her early years, she definitely was. I would find articles listing Nelle, and a lot of times she went as Nellie in these articles. And just when I would think I had found her and I'd follow this story, it didn't make sense to be her, even though it said Nelle Wright. So I wasn't very comfortable with what I was finding in order to attribute it to our Nelle Wright. But I did determine that in several census records, she's listed at home instead of at school, even though her younger brothers are listed at school. I also found the family in an 1880 census of Athens, Pennsylvania, where Eli's father had a farm. And Eli's father passed away just 3 years before that, so maybe they lived in Pennsylvania for a while to take care of things and to sell off the farm. But Nelle references her grandfather's farm later in this program as some of her inspiration. The Wright family also had a cabin in Leech Lake, Minnesota, and it looked like Nelle spent a lot of her youth in Minnesota. There are records of her living there and making many regular visits later in her life with her sisters and her family. And I could also tell that several of her friends that she made in Minnesota, she later brings back to Geneva to work at the estate. Meanwhile, George Fabyan's family owned the Bliss Fabyan and Company dry goods business in Boston. When George was 17, his father insisted he enroll in medical school. George did not want to. Instead, he headed west. George's first job in Chicago was with the Kirby Carpenter Lumber Company. Kirby sent George as their agent to Michigan and to Wisconsin. There, George met Nelle Wright through a business deal with her father, Eli. George and Nelle were married on March 18, 1891 in Minneapolis. And here's their marriage license. Nelle and George start out their early life in Chicago, and this is where they're very active in high society affairs. Parties, politics. On the left, they're listed in the society article for attending a ball. And on the right, George was one of Governor Yates' staff members at a parade. These are just two very small examples of the many opportunities I saw the Fabians had to meet with all these high society people and make connections. This newspaper article in 1905 shares, "The simple life is making an appeal to the very rich. The Fabians don't want a suburban residence, but we're looking for a country place or a summer home," said Nelle. "The Fabians wanted a real farm that will grow eggs and raise milk and all those quaint Arcadian things. Every weekend they got in an automobile and went farm hunting. Mrs. Fabyan said the sport is far superior to bridge indoors." In 1905, George and Nelle buy a 10-acre farm owned by the Harvey family on the Fox River in Geneva. Their estate grew to become 350 acres along the Fox River. They then named their estate Riverbank, along with a working farm, cattle, sheep, goats, corn, wheat, and 20,000 chickens at one time. Over the years, they added buildings and structures to the estate, including a Roman pool, greenhouses, lighthouse, and a windmill. The Fabians were connected to President McKinley through George's father's business partner of Bliss Fabyan and Company. Cornelius Bliss was the treasurer for the Republican National Committee and was asked to accept the nomination as vice president under McKinley, but declined. Had he accepted, he would have become president when McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Nelle and George were part of a special car on a train to attend McKinley's inauguration in 1901. Nelle was the matron of honor for Grace McKinley, niece of the late president, in 1906. And I love this article. I just had to throw this in because Nelle makes the Washington Society paper with this article. "Washington Society women may drink afternoon tea in stockingless feet." And that's Nelle on the left. "Take off your shoes and have some tea, maybe society's salutation to afternoon callers." When Japanese Ambassador Ero Sato was entertained at the country home of Colonel and Mrs. George Fabyan, he removed his shoes and socks when invited to tea. Nelle and guests followed his example. And of course they had tea every day in the villa. And then this wonderful picture was part of Darlene's collection. This is Marshall Fabyan's 40th birthday. It's George's brother. I circled Colonel Fabyan at the top and Nelle there at the bottom. in their beautiful outfits with all of their family. Now let's get into Farmer, which really is going to be the main part of this program because there are so many different avenues and fingers through Nelle's farming love. And this magazine, I give total credit to this program because I found little snippets here and there, but this magazine article is the Green Book magazine. It's December 1920, and they focus on the women farmer. And you know, you read lots of articles that are written after Nelle's death that tell you what they think she was like and what they think she did. This article interviews Nelle. It's fascinating. So I'm going to reference this article quite a bit in this the rest of this program because that was where I would start to get my where else can I find more? So this was kind of what I used as my go-to article to then, okay, I'll put in Nelle Fabyan cattle, I'll put in Nelle Fabyan whatever. So you'll see this article a couple times here. So this was a special feature, and it was called The Farm and the Woman, the Story of Mrs. Fabyan and of Riverbank, a farm that is a commercial hobby. The article states, the little farm was christened Riverbank and turned over to Nelle to operate. Such was the beginning of what is now one of the most famous farms in Illinois. Riverbank is famous for its blooded cattle and dairy products, purebred hogs, poultry and farm produce, greenhouses, prolific grain fields, and stock farm. All are managed by Nelle Fabyan. And then I found some photos of Nelle, of course, on the actual farm. Here she is with the well, right on the estate. It's just west of the Japanese garden on the other side of the walking path. It's not there anymore. And then Nelle also had an office on the estate where she probably ran all of her business from, all of her managing the farm, her paperwork. This was such a beautiful office. Wouldn't everyone love to have one of these? So it's a quaint little cottage at the end of this lattice walkway, just north of the villa by the driveway, but it's no longer there. You see there's a little water underneath and there's a swan over there. I mean, what a lovely setting. And as you walk down the pillar trellis walkway to her office door, there were Concord grape vineyard and a small attached greenhouse. And this is the back of the office. You can see the trellis hallway leading up to it. But I sit there and think, oh my gosh, what was in that office when they took it down? You know, were all these articles that I've been finding online? And you'll see later, I just wish that we could have gotten in there before it was too late. There was also a cottage on the Riverbank farm that was named Nelle's Dollhouse, and it was her private retreat. And they said it was a replica of Nelle's mother's home in England, and it also was no longer there. Back to the Green Book magazine. It states, Nelle Fabyan's special pets revel in the glorious outdoors. During the cold weather, they're housed in the winter garden adjoining the greenhouses. The cages are scattered about the grounds. Molly, Patsy, and Mike, those are the monkeys, were given a place of honor on the lawn near the house, where they can chatter wisely to the passerby. Equally interesting are the cinnamon bears, Tom and Jerry, and Louie the gray wolf. Then there are the coyotes, foxes and alligators, ostriches and deer. Peacocks strut proudly about, and with pheasants, macaws, and Australian doves, the development of the farm has all been a labor of love. And here we do have some pictures, thanks to Darlene. These were the ostrich, which I was told did not last very long in this climate, but she did have them for a while. Then I found this article. Again, it would give me reasons and things to search for. This is a feature article in the 1917 Country Gentleman magazine. Riverbank Farm is highlighted as a show farm for show cattle. And what I loved the best were the photographs. Here's Nelle with Louie the mountain wolf, who was a caged to himself. He looks very much like a German police dog and is so tame that Mrs. Fabyan often takes him walking on a leash. Here's a picture with Mrs. Fabyan with Golden Fern of Riverbank, the splendid Jersey bull that heads her herd. We're going to talk more about that coming up here. And then here's the colonel feeding a deer out of his hand and scratching its nose. It just shows that the animals were such a big part of their lives, and really Nelle's life. and the colonel, obviously the deer liked him. I don't know how many others did, but Nelle really wanted to be surrounded by these animals. And she also put them to work. There's reasons for them being there. Just yesterday, I found this article because I was trying to verify another fact that I had found, and I run into this article. This is also about Nelle's relationship with her animals. 1921 Chicago Tribune article, A Visit to a Garden of Eden on the Fox. And so this author of this article goes out to Geneva from Chicago to visit George and Nelle. It's 1921. And the article, of course, goes on. It's a very large, the middle part has nothing to do with it. That's just a different socialite. But the article is surrounding this whole bride, which I love her headdress, but again, nothing to do with Nelle. There's little snippets in each paragraph about different things on the estate. And some of the usual describing the estate, but there is one paragraph here called The Mistress of Riverbank in one section, and they talk about Nelle's interests were different than her husband's. The writer gives her credit to the design of the Japanese garden, I'm not so sure about that, but talks about her unusual power with animals. It says, a fierce member of the monkey family, a vicious-looking creature who won't let anyone else come near his strongly barred cage, permits her to feed him, scratch his head, and pat his hands with evident pleasure in her company. An enormous police dog named Chamont, the most powerful specimen of the canine race I have ever seen, follows her about and minds her implicitly. She spends her days entirely out of doors, looking after her special departments, and at night sleeps out on an open-air porch, which wholesome life is reflected in her vigorous and interesting personality. So she gets her own little paragraph. And then, of course, this is not Nelle, this is Darlene's, Darlene Larson had this in her collection. This is Belle coming with one of the monkeys, but I thought it would be kind of fun for you to see one of the monkeys. Because I had also read that Belle was also allowed, or the monkey only allowed Belle and Nelle to get close to it. So this is Belle with the monkey. And then this is back to that same article here where it talked about the parrot. And I thought this was funny because the author, if you were to read the whole thing, the author walks up to the villa and he's going to ring the doorbell because he's going to go do his interview, right? And he hears this laughing and this little whispering, and he's like, I don't know if I want to ring this doorbell or not. And it turns out it was a parrot who was in the house and talking to him and joking and laughing. And so then he says, beyond the parrot was a veranda full of birds and fishes. And the author states, all Riverbank is the fruit of imagination and invention. And we do know that Nelle loved her birds. She did have an aviary, which was on the near the villa on the south side, close to Nelle's room and her balcony. And you can see a peacock there in the middle front of this aviary picture. And now back to the Green Book. Here's page 2, and Nelle is quoted, I was born in a small town. I have always been fond of the outdoors. In my girlhood days, I would come down on my riding habit and ride the greater part of the day. When I married and went to the city to live, it almost killed me. Hotel and apartment life smothered me. Society bored me. I longed for the country. My grandfather on my paternal side was a Pennsylvania farmer, and I loved his farm. I'm never as happy as when tramping through the fields, a dog I like by my side. When I'm very tired, tramping or riding rests me more than anything else. So a whole different side of Nelle than you would think. Then I determined to put the farm on a commercial basis, for any such undertaking must have a very definite commercial value in order to hold my interest. I knew that Riverbank had some wonderful money-making possibilities. I saw that in order to operate successfully, I must build an efficient organization. So the farm was incorporated in order to carry it on as a business. All transactions going through a general office, which is under the supervision of a secretary, a clever young Scotchwoman. Well, she's referring to Belle Cumming, her assistant, who actually becomes her very close friend and companion. She goes on with, early in the game, Mrs. Fabyan decided that the only way to farm profitably was to have registered stock of some kind, and she chose Jersey cattle and Berkshire hogs. With Jersey cattle, the quick money is made on the cream, milk, and butter. The hogs are sold for breeding purposes and for the market. Mrs. Fabyan concentrated on show type of hogs, as in the purebred animal, you get better results for breeding purposes. and the animals sell for a price many times in excess of the regular market. Nelle grew quite a reputation with her cattle. In this 1914 Hoard's Dairyman, her jerseys were listed as the keenest, and judging took longer than ever because it was the finest class of aged cows they had ever seen. It said the quality of the animals was defined with the fact that the aged champion from the previous year didn't even earn a place. So she really has this great reputation with her cattle. She runs regular ads in these Jersey Bulletin. I mean, I found probably 50 of these that she runs throughout her span, and she runs an ad, and that's all she even has to say. Riverbank Nelle Fabyan. Everybody knows what that means because she's got such a reputation. She does once in a while run a little bit more of a pictorial ad with her bulls for sale. And of course, everyone wanted one of her bulls if they're going to be that good, right? Some of Nelle's champion jerseys were named. Here's, and you can't see it because it's so little, but these are all the hits I would get on these magazines. But I love the names. Fern's Noble of Riverbank, Golden Noble of Riverbank, Manners Blossom, and Golden Fern of Riverbank. And to your left here is James Hanna, and he and his wife Margaret here. But James was in charge of Nelle's herd, and he traveled with her to the shows. And several times he's mentioned in some of these Jersey bulletins as well. And this is a photograph from Nancy Bell. Thank you, Nancy. And these were Nelle's cattle workers. We don't know exactly who they are, but they're on the Riverbank farm, and the barns were on the west side of Route 31, so on the property across the street from the villa. Nelle's most famous jersey was Ocean Blue. He was a $15,000 Grand Champion bull. He was senior champion bull at the 1914 National Dairy Show, senior champion at the Iowa State Fair, grand champion at Nebraska and Illinois State Fairs, and second class at Waterloo. Here's a write-up about Ocean Blue in the Jersey Bulletin. Ocean Blue is at the head of the herd and captured the blue ribbon in the aged class. There will be nothing able to stand with him. Certainly someone has had hold of him and knows how to feed and care for a Jersey. Unfortunately, Ocean Blue had to be euthanized in 1916 after he became afflicted with tuberculosis. He allegedly contracted it while he was held prisoner at the Hawthorne racetrack in Chicago during hoof and mouth plague. It was reported that his owner believed Ocean Blue contracted tuberculosis when he wasn't given necessary outdoor exercise. So it actually makes the Geneva Republican that they had to shoot him. Back to the Green Book, Nelle also showed Berkshire hogs and won many awards. And these are some of the names. Kingston at Riverbank, Riverbank Lady, Queen of Riverbank, and Riverbank Girl. And this, as the article in the Green Book states, her cows and hogs usually earned purple ribbons. This was a very lucrative branch of farming, for the progeny of purebred animals is very valuable. Purple ribbons are the highest award for excellent quality, and it even beats the blue ribbon for superior quality. And this is another listing you won't be able to read, but again, I ran into tons of these in the Swine World magazine. Again, you know, I just think about her office on the estate. Did it have all these journals in it, and we would have had the actual copy? But you could just go on and on and on for searches for either Riverbank and Nelle, listed as winners all the time. And then I found this article, because now I could search for swine and hog and different words. You know, Google is so fun. Just depends on that one little word that you add to your search. This article in 1916 Daybook entitled, "Is Pig to Take Place of the Lapdog?" shows Nelle Fabyan, society leader, with one of her pigs, and the movie star of the time, Edna Mayo, with her lapdog. And it says, "Will society abandon the lapdog? Will it turn poor toothsome tinkums out in the cold, cold world?" Well, anyway, Mrs. Nelle Fabyan, leader of Smart Society in Chicago and Newport, has a new pet, and it's not a dog. The Green Book magazine also shared that Nelle was the only woman on the board of the National Dairy Show Association and was a director of the Jersey Cattle Club of Illinois and a member of the famous Saddle and Sirloin Club of the Chicago Stockyards. So there, that gave me another search engine to go for, right? And then I found her name on the board of directors in several of the National Dairy Association programs and as a board member. This is a little fuzzy, but this Chicago article, Tribune 1920, Women Take Ribbons. I love this. Women have come out of the kitchen with their sleeves rolled up to their elbows with a determination to demonstrate what they can do in the showing. They are at the international showing their herds with skill and winning honors by the dozens in competition with the men. Mrs. George Fabyan of Geneva, one of the women exhibitors at the livestock show, has already carried many ribbons out of the show ring. So she's out there with all these men competing, and she's winning. And she's quite the woman. And think of the time, this is 1920. Then I found this picture in this Jersey Bulletin Dairy World in 1916, and it didn't have anything to say around it other than it listed people in the picture, and Nelle Fabyan is right there. And I didn't really know what it was until later. I found the article on the left in the Hoosier State Chronicles that mentions a train of fine Jersey cattle on its way from the National Dairy Congress show in Iowa to a stop for a street parade in Indianapolis. It was to carry 168 prize-winning jerseys, and among the prize winners, they list Mrs. Nelle Fabyan of Riverbank Farm, and then the other names they list were all in this caption. So I'm guessing that goes with this picture. Wish it was a little better picture, but Nelle's other passion was dogs. She was a member of the American Kennel Club and showed West Highland White Terriers and English Bulldogs. The article states, the Riverbank Kennels would arouse any dog's lover's enthusiasm. Here's a picture of the kennels on the estate, and I believe they're on the north side behind the barn. And then, of course, we have several pictures of Nelle with her dogs. Here she's, and then remember this bench later that she's got the dogs on too. We'll talk about that coming up. And you can barely see the dog there at the bottom. She's standing outside her gazebo. James Kirkpatrick was Nelle's dog trainer and handler. I found an American Kennel Club stud book with Nelle's dogs listed. The West Highland White Terriers' names were Inverness Gary, Inverness Jen, it just says G-E-N, period. Does that mean Geneva? I don't know what it stands for. Riverbank Jock and Riverbank Sandy. And then her bulldogs were Kilburn Bertha, Riverbank Scranton, and Scranton Billy Jr. The Dog Fancier magazine in 1917 lists Nelle's dogs as winners in the Bulldog and West Highland White Terrier entries. And again, I could show you 50 of these. She's listed throughout all the time, winning and bringing home prizes. And just the competition, imagine all that, you know, because you got to load them all into trains or however else they're getting them to all these places. And then this is another fun article. She was big competition and written up in the Chicago Tribune as rival to Mrs. Peabody. Society women are grooming their dogs for what promises to be the most spirited contest in years at the Chicago Kennel Club's annual show. Mrs. George Fabyan, there she is on the bottom, will show her West Highland White Terriers and Bulldogs. She's big competition. Another cute picture. And again, note that bench. We're going to talk about some of that coming up here. She has the dog posing on. I love his face. This is my favorite, though. This was in Darlene's collection. It's Nelle, and the Fabyan chauffeur, Bert Williams, is driving her in a 1916 Stutz Bearcat, one of her West Highland White Terriers on top of the hood. Who knows if they're really moving or they're just sitting there, but... And I just love her face. You know, I took a magnifying glass to it, and she's just happy. She's smiling and just loving life. The Green Book article went on to say that making the chicken farm earn money was one of the biggest problems on the Riverbank farm at that time, and that at any time any particular department of the farm misses fire financially, it was treated as a major problem. So the chicken raising department was under close observation during the writing of this article. Over 4,000 chickens had been raised that year in 1920. So 12,000 to 18,000 white leghorn and a small number of buff Orpington. So I looked these up. These are not her actual birds, but I just wanted to know, what is a white leghorn and what is a buff Orpington? They were raised during the year by Mr. Fern of Elgin. So she always has her specialists come and help her and run it, and she manages everything else. Nelle specialized in these longhorns because she considered them best for market purposes. They lay more than the average hen, and their egg has a more delicate flavor. Milk, cream, butter, and eggs were shipped regularly to Chicago. In 1908, Riverbank Poultry Farm is listed as winners of the SC, or single comb, white leghorns, and for their buff Orpingtons. The Orpington is a British breed of chicken. It was intended to be a dual-purpose breed, to be reared both for eggs and for meat, but soon became exclusively a showbird. And here, thanks to Darlene, these are the chickens on the Fabyan estate. There was a row of 12 to 15 chicken houses built on skids on the east side of the river, and they were on the skids so they could be moved around as needed. Riverbank Farm also had a pigeon loft, and it was profitable and a fascinating hobby. George and Nelle belonged to the flying club and trained pigeons for flying purposes. In 1920, Riverbank pigeons were entered into the yearling race, which was 100 miles, and they won. During the war, carrier pigeons were trained at Riverbank for government work. And then, of course, now I had a new thing to search for. So I found this American Poultry Journal in 1909. Riverbank Farm has an advertisement for their homing pigeons for sale. And here, the pigeon cages were mounted along the entire south ridge of the roof of this maintenance building that extended east from the back end of the Fabyan garage. There were cages for approximately 300 pigeons. One variety was for eating, for the family's weekly menu included squab. And of course, that maintenance building no longer exists. That was taken off. Nelle also managed 6 greenhouses on the farm, and they were all money makers. Roses, carnations, violets, and ferns were the specialties. The flowers were shipped to the Flower Growers Association in Chicago, and from there sent all over the country. She hired people to help her again. I found this ad advertisement for daisies from Riverbank, and then another advertisement on the right for Proshel hot water heating systems, and Riverbank Greenhouses was endorsing them. It lists Charles Macaulay as vice president and manager of the greenhouses. And Macaulay later moves his greenhouses from the estate to Western Avenue, and many of you remember the great Geneva greenhouses. At least one of them came from that site that we know of. And here's just a great photo you can see of some of the greenhouses on the estate. This is the indoor greenhouse, or the conservatory, where some of the animals would go in the winter. But look how lovely. They even have chairs set up. I'm sure it was kind of a little social gathering place, too. Now we get into sculpture, which I found so fascinating. So the Green Book article continues with this that I was not aware. The work is original. The pieces are done in all colors and finished by a secret process, Mrs. Fabyan's discovery. It is very different from anything else on the market, and all handwork. The workshop is filled with all sorts of interesting pieces in the making. Mrs. Fabyan has in her employee an Italian Silvio Silvestri, who is a very superior workman. She does her own designing, and some of her pieces have attracted national attention. She is said to be the only woman in the country doing this kind of work. Which I thought, wow, that makes so much sense. All the cement pieces on that property, it just clicks, you know, it makes sense. Articles for both interior and outdoor use are made to meet all needs. The Riverbank grounds are decorated with them. All kinds of unusual tables, benches, and chairs are scattered about. At the recent National Conference on Concrete House Construction, a gathering of architects and concrete men from all over the United States, Mrs. Fabyan had the honor of furnishing the exhibit for a room. She has been asked to serve on a committee at the Own Your Own Home exposition, which is to be held in New York next spring. So here's all this whole men's group, and they're inviting her to come in and exhibit her work and her knowledge. So, of course, it gave me something else to search for. I found the Concrete Products National Conference in 1920. Of course, there they list her as an exhibitor. It says, beautiful concrete statuary and furniture were on view through the courtesy of Mrs. George Fabyan of Geneva and the Mooseheart Institute, which I found that interesting too. It was a revelation to many to see the beautiful work which could be accomplished by artistic care. Did a little more digging on this and found her picture of her exhibit. And it says at the bottom, it is beautiful furniture exhibited by Mrs. George Fabyan of Geneva, Illinois, and the Loyal Order of Moose. And you can see the similarity. It's not that great of a picture, but you can, those benches that you saw the dogs perching on, and the things you even see there now as you walk around, that is their work and their design. This Chicago Tribune article that states 2 years of experiment have convinced Mrs. George Fabyan that with concrete all things are possible. At her home near Geneva, Illinois, she has turned the substance commonly used for roads and bridges and buildings into ornamental bric-a-brac and objects of art. Statuary, inverted light fixtures, dishes, and decorative plaques, which she made by simply turning the liquid concrete into a form. They were all exhibited yesterday at the American Concrete Convention at the auditorium. All work shows resembled marble in its smoothness of surface. And here is the crushed stone on the property. This is where they did their own crushing of the stone to make their own sidewalks throughout the property and their own walkways. So Nelle had a direct connection to get her supply to work on her creations. Nelle's technique, they said, in our last brown bag we had last month, what's his name, the windmill guy?
Dennis?
Yes, Dennis Kintop was here. And people were asking, like, how can we help repair some of this stuff? And people were just asking questions. He said he's worked in concrete for years, and he said, this stuff is very, very hard, if not impossible, to replicate. They don't know what he said there's no seams. You know, you think of a form, and you're going to see a seam. And so he said, you know, a lot of guys don't even want to touch it because they don't know what to do to bring it back to its glory, which I thought was interesting hearing that from a concrete person today. But it is different. It's smooth, and we have a few pieces in the gallery. They're shiny, they sparkle, they're beautiful. And then Nelle's cement art is written about in the Tribune in 1917 with a quote from her. If at first you don't succeed, sculpt. If you find yourself in need, sculpt. If you discover you're getting somewhat tired of suffragetting, perk up, sad soul, and cease your fretting, sculpt. Like everyone's got the ability to do that, but that's her advice for women in 1917. It highlights her exhibit at the Chicago Cement Show. Her booth was entitled Riverbank Studio, and then she told the history later on of how it all developed. She said, this is a quote, "I discovered that cement is one of the most adaptable of all material with which to construct lasting and seemly pieces of sculpture. I started originally with the idea of making just some figures and pieces for my home in Geneva. I got Silvio and Serafino Silvestri, cement stone artists, to work out some of my ideas, and I began to get quite proficient myself. By the time the driveway pieces and garden urns had been completed, the studio became permanent. Heroic models of griffins, dogs, and other animals are shown in Mrs. Fabyan's booth. There are huge columns, tables molded of cement, vases, urns, but one of the most striking was a figure of a militant screaming eagle with wings spread ready to descend on its prey. The piece weighed 500 pounds. And now, philanthropist. Throughout the early 1900s, while the Fabians lived in Chicago, Nelle offered support several times to a prison called Bridewell, known as the Chicago House of Correction. She went through the crowded conditions and visited the women's department and gave the superintendent $100 to pay fines for the girls he thought were deserving. The girl would promise to repay in weekly installments and replenish the fund so it could be used to release more girls and use over and over and over again. Pretty clever idea there. 1904. $100 was a pretty big deal. Nelle was active locally here in Geneva on the board of the Colonial Hospital in 1914. And you can tell why they did that, because then later she donates radium to Colonial Hospital for use in treating cancer and other disease. Dr. Raymond Scott said in his remarks that this has been made possible through the humanitarian interest of Nelle Fabyan to afford relief and cure to those unfortunate people in our own Fox Valley to whom the expense of going elsewhere for treatment would be prohibitive. And in the 1919 Jersey Bulletin, Nelle offered a $1,000 trophy to the premier winner as a gift. The trophy would become the permanent property of any exhibition winning it 3 times. If you didn't win it 3 times, you only got a small replica to take home. So they didn't think there'd be anybody successful, but one Longview Farm wins it right away in the 3rd year and gets to take it home. So the actual trophy was a cow with a well-filled udder, and it was called Foster Mother of Humanity. I have looked for that, believe me. I searched for that. I wanted to find a picture. I couldn't find anything. So later in 1929, Nelle offers prizes of gold, $100, $50, and $25. So she was very charitable, even in the things she was involved with. Nelle's involvement in the farm and other activities slowed in the 1930s. Nelle had a close relationship with her sisters, Jess and Leah, who both moved to Geneva after their husband's military service. Here are the 3 sisters, Jess Harris, Leah Trott, and Nelle Fabyan, at Leech Lake in Walker, Minnesota, at their family summer cottage. Here's another picture of the 3 of them. And I love this. This is a photo of Jessie, Nelle, and Leah with chauffeur Bert Williams from Darlene's collection. And on the back of the photo, it had that quote, "Our car had a bulletproof back window which saved our lives that trip from a hunter who cannot tell an automobile from a deer." Bert Williams was such a careful chauffeur. And then we have this in our collection. It's just very sweet. This was a gift. Card from Nelle and Jess to their sister Leah on her birthday in 1918. It's just, Leah's birthday. These are our sentiments with love, Nelle and Jess. A little poem about sisters. The closing of the Green Book magazine article says that in summer, Nelle dressed in short skirts, sturdy shoes, and a sport hat, tramping through the fields, a dog at her side. In the winter, a warm coat, knickerbockers, and high boots are the usual costume. Here's another photo of Nelle. I thought I'd share just a few more photos that we have of her that I don't really have a context for. This is Nelle with staff member Cora Jensen in the Japanese garden. And here's Nelle with her cook, Margaret Dwyer, standing at the gate at the end of the rose arbor on the estate. And Nelle in her later years. George Fabyan died in 1936 at the age of 69. Nelle kept the farm going with help from the staff, and it was later said the estate manager and her good friend Belle Cumming moved into the villa. I'm not sure if that's true or not, to keep her company. But I did find this. George didn't want to travel. He said, "Why would I want to go anywhere else when I have all this right here," right? But it looks like Nelle wanted to. This is her passport on the left in 1913, so she had a passport for a while. That year that she got the passport, she was 47. It states there she was 5 foot 2.5 inches tall. We all know she was quite short. Not sure if that's accurate either, but that's what she wrote. And it says brown eyes and so on. But on the right here, in 1937, the year after George's death, Nelle is listed as a passenger on the Queen Mary. The Geneva Republican states that she and her estate manager and personal companion, Belle Cumming, traveled together to visit Scotland. Possibly to visit Cumming's family, because that's where she's from. I'm not sure. But I did find it interesting, on the trip home, Belle gets stuck in Scotland because she gets typhoid fever or something. She doesn't die from it, but she doesn't, so Nelle's got to travel all by herself on the way home. Nelle died in 1939 after suffering a stroke. She's buried along with the Fabyan family in Massachusetts. Nelle and George did not have any children. It's also interesting to note that her sisters Jess and Leah didn't have any children either. Nelle's will awarded several faithful employees with money. The animals she owned, including deer, bear, and others, were listed to be as sold, given away, or destroyed by proper means as soon as possible. The remainder of the property to be sold within 5 years for the best price and terms available, she said. Her friend Belle Cumming was authorized to live on the estate rent-free for as long as she liked. However, in 1946, Belle and 2 other women were hit by a train crossing here on South 3rd Street and all were killed. So Belle only is there for a little bit longer after Nelle. Riverbank Labs was to be put in a trust, and the ownership could be transferred to a corporation later for educational purposes. Nelle Fabyan set up a trust now called the Fabyan Foundation, who funded our exhibit and who funded our kids' exhibit. They're great. They only fund educational projects and scholarships. So in this article, they say $375,000 estate. I looked it up in today's cost, that's over $8 million. That's Nelle. Heidi, can you turn those marquee lights on? Does anyone have any questions? I mean, I did so much research, and like I said, even yesterday I was running into stuff. I'm like, stop already, stop. Oh, I did find she had Clydesdales too. She's listed in a Clydesdale stud book. So I just found that out last week. I'm sorry, I saw a hand right here.
I have a question for you. I know it was always, I was under the assumption, I never checked it, but that I know she didn't have children, they didn't have children, so they donated, what I understood was the property to the community, to the forest reserve, that's 350 acres. But then I saw an interesting article that said it had been sold to the forest preserve for $70,000, am I correct?
Yes, so right, I have Kelsey here from Preservation Partners and Al Watts too to help back me up with any answers I don't know. It was sold to the Forest Preserve, correct? Not donated. Yes.
Do you know if she related at all to the women who worked on the science side, wives of husbands, and on George's, brought in all those scientists and what have you to do?
Not that I know of, anybody on the science side. It's like they led two separate lives in a way. George was on the science and doing all that, and Nelle managed the farm. And I don't know if George really he's not listed in any of this stuff of being active with any of her farming or any of her shows. I just think they both had separate interests, and the property was right to do that in.
You mentioned moving the animals, but how about moving all that concrete?
Yeah, 500 pounds. When I read that, how'd she bring that to the show?
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Any other questions? She's just fascinating. Like I said, each thing that I would learn would just lead me to another thing. I'm like, well, I'll just try that word. And you could put Nellie, and of course back in the I had to put Mrs. Fabyan a lot, Mrs. George Fabyan. So it just depended on tweaking one little word, and I'd get another hit, and I'd be like, oh, I'm done. I found everything. Oh no, you didn't. So I'm sure we could keep going. Nance?
Carrie, you could put this together in a book.
I don't know. Maybe.
Yes, it should be preserved somewhere.
Yeah.
She really was quite interesting. I'm fascinated with her. I just, I think, no one talked about her. You hear some of the little stories here and there, but to see the depth of it and considering the time period, it was amazing. And the concrete blew me away. I knew some of the other stuff. I had no idea about the concrete.
We finally toured the home, and it's such an interesting tour. We've lived in the Fox Valley for over 50 years, but we finally did that tour.
Well, you can thank Preservation Partners for that.
Yeah.
We're going to do trolley tours, we hope, in Swedish days.
Pretty sure I got your email, I haven't read it yet.
Okay, but we're hoping to maybe include the Fabyan Villa in the trolley tour and do tours there too. Craig, did you have a question?
You mentioned in your research that you were thinking maybe there was a connection between Frank Lloyd, right?
Yeah.
And her family, you never did?
I couldn't find one. Have you guys ever found anything?
The house.
The house.
Yeah.
Well, but the Wright, because it's Nelle Wright
Oh.
and Frank Lloyd Wright, so, and both Wisconsin. It's like I tried early on to connect those. I couldn't even find like any kind of crooked path. But I thought the same thing, and unless somebody else has other info, I couldn't find anything on my end. I tried, because I thought the same thing. Chuck?
On this estate, they had a lot of people working for them. How many total people, employees did they have? Because they had so many different operations.
I've read sometimes up to 125, but I think it fluctuated probably throughout time. And that's why they had several cooks. Like they had their own personal cook, which I think was that Margaret Dwyer. But then they had another cook, Pearl Butler, who cooked for like the staff. So they had, it was like it was its own little world. It really was. And there was another article that there was a bunch of rumors talking about Colonel Fabyan was going to buy Colonial Hospital and name it Fabyan Hospital. There's all these stories, that they had to live through. And there was even a story about people thought that Nelle was Japanese. and that's why the garden was done for her honor. And she's even quoted, and she's like, well, next they're gonna say I'm Chinese, so she's like, whatever, you know. She just kind of rubs it off, but it's a very mysterious world, and I think people enjoyed making up stories. But the Fabians did make their property available to the public, mostly on the weekends, but you were, no cars, you had to walk on the path, and there were certain areas that were private, but they wanted it to be shared with the community, and I think they got their wish. I think what the Forest Preserve is doing is exactly what they wanted. Now we just have to take care of it. Colin.
In the 20th century, hobby farms for the very wealthy were incredibly popular because they were a good tax write-off.
Sure.
There's candy farms in Gary and various other places around. My dad was field secretary of the Illinois Granger Breeders Association, and they were all over the place. But nothing ever came out of any of those farms like what came out of this. I mean, it's exceptional.
It is.
Beyond exceptional.
And she was right, she turned it into a business. Everything had to be money-making. It wasn't just brought in just because she thought it was pretty or cool. It was, what are we gonna do with this, and how are we gonna turn this into a business and make it work? And they monitored it all. I mean, yeah, oh gosh, the chickens aren't doing good. Now we gotta change something. So it was a business, a serious one.
That seems so contrary to what her husband did.
It does, it really does. But what a wonderful thing. We're so glad to have it here in Geneva, and I'm glad you came today. I hope you learned something. I know I did, and my head is full of her, so I'm glad to let that off and give it to you. I can get some of my brain back. Thank you all for coming. Next month we have, Heidi will be doing a great program about the history of South 3rd Street. You get to learn how it all changed from residential to what it is today. And she's worked her butt off on that. Wait till you see. That's in her brain. So our brains are always full. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the exhibit.